Yeah. I think that's kind of a good, but it is. That's why I think. Okay. Hi everyone. Welcome. Thank you very much for coming, and for those of you online, welcome as well. I'm so excited to have Jessica Horn here. I feel like I've arrived now as an African feminist activist. So, yeah, I will leave it to Lucia to properly introduce Jessica. And I'm just going to introduce the format of the event, and then I'm going to hand over. So we are going to have a Q&A session about this book, which is why we're here. And then Priya is going to give a response to the book, which Jessica will be allowed to answer to, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So without further ado.
So hello, everyone. I'm Lucia. I am a PhD researcher here on regenerative activism, and I'm super, super happy to have Jessica with us today. Before introducing us, let me introduce you. Tessa. Tessa is an artist, is an activist, and is a research fellow at IDS. She grew up in Zimbabwe after studying in South Africa, and you were born in England because your father was in exile here due to his struggle against the apartheid in South Africa. So thank you. Jessica, when they asked me to present you, I said, I have so many things to say about you that are not maybe things I should not share. So I will start about the formalities. So Jessica is an East African feminist writer and practitioner. She has more than 2 decades of experience in philanthropy. She pioneered the Futures Initiative at the African Women's Development Fund and became the first African woman to lead the Ford Foundation Regional Office for East Africa. She also co-founded the Our Africa platform for African women's voice on openDemocracy. And you served as a commissioner at the Lancet Commission on Gender and Global Health. So thank you again for being here. I have to say, Jessica, that even if I tried not to introduce you personally, that when I arrived in England from Brazil around 7 years ago, we worked together at the board of the Fund for Global Human Rights, where we kept trying to move the compass to the global south, right? And one day I came back to Brighton and I called you in London and I said, Jessica, I need help. And you said, with what? Is it for work? I said, no, I would like some help because I'm trying to get pregnant and this has been a struggle. And then you said, I said, do you know any clinic, fertility clinic in London? And you said, no, but you might not need one more clinic. You might need more women around you. And here we are with my son at 4, and you are partly responsible for that. So thank you so much for sharing this. The personal is political. So here we are. Jessica, before I give the mic to Tessa to ask you some questions, when I started to read the book, I was very touched by what you said, that in your childhood, the material culture of protest, revolution, and emancipatory nationalist dreaming was all around you, as you say, and praxis was a map to navigate it. And you quote Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator and philosopher, very dear to me, saying that praxis is being, doing, and thinking at the same time, with no divide. And I think we all here in academia, in action, research, try to do that. But we also struggle. I struggle myself. And this really touched me. And also in the introduction of the book, you said, I'm not the one who's going to try to define feminism, but I quote you, you said, feminism for me is that we all dream and want to live in a world where no woman dies sad. This really touched me. So as Tessa said, we are going to do this in a conversational format. So Tessa has the first question to you. Thank you again for being here. Yeah?
I don't know. Thank you. And I failed to introduce you as well. Apologies. So, Lucia is a Brazilian human rights activist and political scientist with expertise in the field of democracy and social change and human rights, and is currently, luckily for us, doing her PhD here on regenerative activism. And I have the great pleasure of co-supervising her. Jessica, I wanted to ask you, first of all, why this, why now? And obviously I have some thoughts on that. And I also wanted I guess, respond to something that you said as well. What I thought was really interesting in the form of the book, apart from the way that you've divided it up, which we can talk about a bit later, but that there's a kind of an effective move from despair to hope almost in each of the chapters, which I imagine is entirely intentional. But also, I was really struck by your use of Bakari Yusuf's archival futures, and then also this kind of a lot of you talking about contributing to an us, to a collectivism, and talking about interdependence. And in this kind of moment where it feels like we've entirely lost all the lessons of COVID around that, I wanted you to talk to that in your answer. So why this? Why now? Both personally and politically, and who is your audience? That's not too many questions bundled into one.
Thank you, Tessa, and to all of you here, and for everybody coming, everybody online. It's really an honor to be able to share this at the beginning of this journey of sharing it with the world. I should say that the very first time I came to IDS was probably about 20 years ago for a session around sexualities. And one of the people that I met there for the second time, but that I remember from that session, was Eva Joyce Wynn, who was a Zimbabwean feminist activist who did really brave, pioneering work on many issues. She was a real truth teller. She was a person who would always call out hypocrisy. And she was a big defender of secularism and actually pushing up against some of the use of religion as a way to limit space in movement. And she passed away 2 days ago now. And so I just wanted to honor her as we begin this, just as part of the reason actually why I wrote this book. To be totally honest with you, it was because I have been a part of feminist movement space. And I realized how the people who I was with, or who I knew, or who I connected to somehow, or watched from afar in admiration or support or whatever way, would offer everything of themselves, sometimes even to the point of death, with absolutely no recognition, with no echo of their memory, with no proper analysis of their offering. And to me, it felt like violence. And so I really felt strongly, because I also have one of those minds that remembers everything. I remember everything. And so I just felt really responsible to actually write down these little moments, but also write down the things that I knew had happened, which, like I said, I think a lot of people don't know, particularly if people were not directly connected to it. So a large part of writing this was literally just a sense of responsibility to actually remember. And to me, because my whole argument of this book is that African feminisms are basically a continuity of African liberation struggles. There is nothing separate about it. Actually, the feminisms were born in the context of liberation movements, and they're a continuation of an African liberation project. And the fact that that is constantly not recognized, to me, like I said, is an epistemic violence, but also in the lives of individuals, it actually constitutes an emotional violence. When I wrote portions of the book, I actually, in some cases, many of the stories I either remembered, so I wanted to make sure they were accurate. So I actually sent the text to the people that I'm talking about to say, is this a fair representation? Is this okay with you to write it like this? And in some cases, people were really shocked. They were crying because, again, they sacrificed everything. And none of it was remembered. It was remembered by a small group of people, but ultimately it's as if it didn't matter. So it was really that, it was just really out of a sense of obligation. I just felt like an obligated witness to incredible praxis, and I felt that it was important to write it. Why not? We read so much of all sorts of things. Why not? Why not? And actually, I reference in there Sylvia Tamale's analysis of the space that African feminists occupy in global knowledge production. It's minimal, right? There's so much of the infrastructure of global knowledge production excludes African feminists. And so again, if there was a way to contribute to that, good. And I do say there that this is one vantage point. My voice is not meant to be totemic. So if you disagree, beautiful. What's even better, write it. Okay. So that's really the impetus behind the book. And yes, so Bibi Bakari Yusuf is a Nigerian feminist scholar and also publisher. So she's the founder of Cartographies Press. And she speaks about this thing of needing to really consider and help create an archival future. That basically, if we do not document what exists now, if we leave no trace that can be found, we basically are also diminishing our archive. So it's almost like it's imperative to actually document the now or document what we know. There are things that we know have happened that again are hard to find. Research them, produce them, sing them, write them in poems, and we don't only have to write books, but create something that leaves a trace that can be found beyond just the people who directly experienced it. And so she speaks about that as the process of creating an archival future. And again, I think in the global geopolitics of knowledge production for any African, but also certainly African gender in a way that creates a power imbalance. So women and non-binary people, it's actually critical to create an archive and to leave a bigger archive. In terms of the now, I mean, it was, I am a mom, and so I actually left my job to give myself a self-funded sabbatical to sit and write. I didn't know how, I just felt like I needed to do it. I agonized a lot when I was a new mom, and so I actually had no time, and so it kind of didn't happen. And so it was just very fortunate that David Spencer, who's the commissioning editor for this Social Science for Social Justice series with Sage, got in touch out of the blue and said, hey, would you consider writing a book? And I said, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. So it was a power manifesting, but it took quite a while to rush it. So in terms of like that it arrived in January of this year, I can't lay claim to historical timing. But what I would say is that yes, if we're talking about, and we can continue to talk about this, I feel like it's an important thing to really dig into. If we're dealing with the times that we have now, where it feels like so much of what people have tried to contribute to the world in terms of building out infrastructure, it wasn't just visions, it was infrastructure, like even international human rights law. You can critique it, everything should be critiqued. However, I am more happy that it exists, right, than that if it didn't, okay? I like the fact that there's actually international law that says that my rights should not be violated, right? I actually like that. So all of that infrastructure that we've built is being questioned, is being critiqued, is being defunded, is being eroded. And so to me, I think it's just a lesson in the fact that nothing is given, everything is fought for. And so that is why we have to continue and to remember, right, to value the contributions of people who have actually helped to create what's been built, to defend it, and also that it's possible for things to change. If people actually manage to overthrow colonial oppressors, who had a significantly asymmetrical access to power in the means of violence, okay, and economy, it is possible for us to also contest in the moments that we live in and to do something about it. So I think it's important to study history, but then to also be a part of creating it. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jessica, you say also in the introduction of the book, African feminist knowledge is marginalized in the infrastructure of publishing and dissemination, as you just said, and emerged from different sources, novels, conference, poems, blog posts, songs, and you even quote someone else saying, like, you can see whatever you want. If you want to be heard, you have to publish, right? In the mainstream knowledge system, right? And then you said that this book is somehow a mosaic of weaving of all the sources that you're trying to be one more voice, not the only one, but one more voice there weaving all of this. And to organize this weaving, you choose 5 cardinal principles, right? that are kinship, courage, care, pleasure, and memory. Each of them one chapter of the book. Can you tell us a bit more how these five principles came about, why them, and a little bit about each of them? Okay.
So I put together, all of the kind of the areas and sort of forms of practice that I wanted to write about, and I just thought, how am I going to organize this? One of the things I knew for sure that I did not want to do is to organize it according to the SDGs. And so, I just felt like ultimately, what are people trying to achieve here? Like what are the core questions? And so I picked these as the kind of the animating principles, I guess, underlying what people were trying to do. And I began with kinship. It's kind of the heaviest chapter, but it really was just this question of, and you asked about the collective. So if ultimately our work of the process of contributing to liberatory worlds is ultimately a process of articulating an us, right? Like, how do we want to live together, right? How do we want to relate to each other? How we want to acknowledge the differences that we have between us and amongst us, and create space so that everybody has the capacity to thrive in that world. Okay, it's about creating an us. And as I looked back, because I wanted to write about kind of actually the last 20 years of African feminist activism, because it's what I knew. Of course, I needed to research, and as I read, and as I thought more, of course, it all went back to independence struggles, So, and so you then start realizing, you're like, wait a minute. Actually, African women were, and on the record, I actually found no mention of trans or non-binary people is the reason for saying women. To be fair, the record is not there. So African women were active in the struggles for liberation, active in shaping them, not just as kind of like cannon fodder or people bringing tea. They were active in shaping the thought about what to do, the practice of doing it, right, in all these different ways. Incredibly brave action. And then at independence, all the nations basically codified gender inequality. Can you imagine that you literally put your life, some of these people were teenagers running away from home to join the liberation armies in the neighboring countries, okay? 14, 15-year-old girls ran away to join liberation armies, to be part of the process of liberating their regions. And it comes to independence, and your constitutions and all of your laws basically codify marital rape, codify, inequality in the system. I mean, it's kind of wild. So to me, my question was, what are African feminists doing to try to create us? So that's what the kinship chapter is trying to ask. It's just like, but if we say we practice the philosophy of Ubuntu, which is common across Bantu concept, but it's common across African societies, to be fair, because people live together, so there's some kind of theory of way of shaping how you live together, so it works. How can it be that this Ubuntu is done with the exclusion of us? Are we not people? Are we not people? So it was foundational actually to have to begin with that. And then look at courage and really question, again, this idea that the brave is this figure of militarized masculinity largely. What else? What other kinds of courage are articulated actually in the transformation of the world? Care, has actually really emerged as both a demand, but also a practice. And I think movements of women living with HIV were really foundational in pushing conversations of care to a far more shared space. And we don't acknowledge that very much. That's why I keep insisting on mentioning it, because women living with HIV actually modeled forms of accessible care and praxis in ways that are actually still very instructive for us. But also because of this deep knowing, I think, across feminisms, that there's a need to think about, right, interiority and how interiority is affected by oppression. And so therefore to create methods to actually deal with the interior implications of external violence, this external structural inequality. Pleasure lies at the center of any liberatory work. What's the point? If you can't enjoy your life, what's the point? Freedom is pleasurable, right? So pleasure actually is integrated as part of liberatory work, and I think feminisms have been the best in some respects, and actually embracing that. And then memory, and you know, I spoke a lot about it in terms of the reasons at the beginning to Tessa's question about why the book. But to quote Lebon, she says, you know, because erasure, you focus on memory because erasure is an instinct of conquest. And so again, because of this deep erasure of our labors, it seemed important to then also look at the many deep efforts that African feminists have made to resurrect or to share or to build an archive, not just in terms, like I said, of the written word. Sometimes it's actually an archive in spirit, in feeling, expressed in different media, but that carry the memory actually of what it is we're doing, but also the people that have contributed to this transformative energy.
Thank you. I really loved your section on care in the book, and I felt like your passion around embodiment really kind of shows in your writing in that section. And I know you studied medical anthropology, and I wanted you to talk a little bit about the thing that Lucia mentioned in her introduction, which is kind of knowledge production and doing as thinking.
So one of the things that becomes very difficult actually when you write in English is that you realize that the English language, especially academic language or sort of formal ways of talking, is so steeped in Cartesian thinking that you can't find the words. Like actually in the memory section I was writing about this moment with Tandiswa Mazwai singing, where, and it was just by chance, not by chance, by moment, she was singing this song that in part is giving reference to Winnie Mandela right at the moment that Winnie Mandela is dying. She didn't know, but she's clearly channeling the spirit and sharing it with this group of Black women who had come to this, you know, performance that she'd done. And I couldn't, it was really difficult to write it because I was like, English doesn't, there's no words for this in English. You know, like English doesn't allow for expressing things that are feeling thinking. You know, like literally feeling presumes a lack of thought. You know, to feel, it's as if feeling doesn't, precludes thinking, which is ridiculous. So, you know, writing about care is difficult in that way because you find that actually a lot of the language to describe it falls apart. And I think it's probably why even making the case for care is difficult. We can talk more about that. But ultimately, we live in our bodies. Our bodies are actually our homes. That's where we live. Our body is our first home. It's not the country. It's not the nation, guys. Our body is our first home. And it's ultimately where all politics is articulated. It's where all politics is felt. The implications of all politics sits in our bodies, right? The decisions about whether or not there will be like big agric, right, is more important than our health, means that we end up in an East Africa where cancer rates are soaring because everybody is eating food that is just filled with carcinogenic pesticide, okay? So the reality is that politics is always felt in the body. And so if you're gonna do any work that's transformative at a deep enough level, it has to include care. There's no way to not, right? And it's almost like if you do, it means that it's actually not a deep enough transformation because care is what gets at that piece, like I said, that's slightly less visible, but just as critical. So, you know, I speak about the fact that distress is always political. There's distress, emotional distress, and the physical distress of our body is caused by structural injustice. And so if we're going to transform the distress, the care cannot just be, we have short-term measures of ways of coping, of resilience. We deal with our Reikis and our body works and our rebalancing and our mutual song and all of that, those things that reconstitute us and help us be more resilient. But ultimately, care work is about dealing with the source of the distress in the first place. And so the work of shifting structural injustice that creates the reason. Repair, if all politics is lived in the body and all injustice is lived in the body, it means that repair must also happen in the body. And I do, just to close on this one, I mean, on the cover of the book is actually, the pictures all mean they're not stock photos. So they're actually all more or less photos are taken actually. But these women here with the beans are a group of women in Kavu in Eastern Congo, who are part of the extended project of the Panzi Hospital. And I speak about the work that they do, the regenerative farming, but also care work that they build together as a community through the farming and through kind of collective care practices. And again, this care process happens in many ways and in many spaces. So I also feel like we need to expand out in our conversations about this. And that's really what decolonizing, thinking about, emotional well-being and mental health means. We're also expanding out of the idea that care means going to a counselor. It's about like I said, building up people's resilience and capacity to engage the world, and healing in that way, but also dealing with the structural roots so that the distress doesn't keep happening to them. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessica. Also, the same chapter of care that I also loved, you mentioned psychologist Peace Kigua that coined the term psychopolitics of care in African feminism. And you said she encourages attention to the interiority, but framed by the colonial African feminist vision that seeks to understand the structural conditions that shape how we feel. And you navigate through the chapter on interiority and exteriority, how we have, when dealing with care, remind ourselves that 1 in every 3 women and girls in the African continent will be subject to sexual, physical violence by an intimate partner, and how we have to relate this or rate dances with structural conditions of the world. But then you move to inside organizations, and you talk us through Hope Shirudo and Rudo, her daughter, that says each organization has a soul, and how sometimes in organizations we forget this, or we lose our souls, right? As a group, and also so people that PhD. And with your experience also as a funder, how do you think funders or the business model, even this concept makes me, of the civil societies contribute to this, to the erosion of the soul, or to the forgetting care either individually or collectively?
So of course, movements are constellations. So movements are not just individual actors. We often imagine a movement as a group of people protesting in the street. That's our common kind of that vision of visual movement. But movements are constellations of actors, sometimes individuals, sometimes loosely organized in collectives of different kinds, but also with some institutional anchors. But it is true that what has been a little bit awkward, I think, about some of this type of deeply transformative praxis is when it's become part of the NGO structure. It's awkward because it's a bit of an awkward fit. So as you're saying, NGOs are largely structured in regulatory sense to comply with certain ways of forms of business, from a regulatory perspective. So it means that it's almost unavoidable. And also, once you create an organization, it's infrastructure that requires longevity, which means it requires funding. And almost no NGO has cracked the ability to be independent of institutional resourcing. So if you think about it in those kind of onions, that like an onion. So yes, I mean, I would say that not taking into account care in organizations that are committed in some way to a movement-linked vision So I'd say any organization that works in any way on questions of rights or justice is linked to a movement vision, because those ideas came out of movement, right? Every right that's codified in law actually came out of people's organizing and some kind of ground up demand for change, right? We know the weekend, right? The weekend would not exist if it weren't for workers organizing so that they can have a break, right? So the weekend was not given by a court or given by lawmakers. The weekend was actually given by workers who were organizing so that they can have reasonable break in between periods of work. So all of the, again, institutional demands around rights and justice ultimately come out of people's struggle. So, but again, they're now in an institutional form, which is resourced and which have frameworks and board of trustees and decision-making processes and all of that. I think one of the things that many institutional donors have done, taking that from the governmental side actually, but also to some extent from philanthropy as well, have sustained actually this argument that the money has to get to the ground and therefore cannot be given in overhead. And so you'll find about 10 to 12% of the budget of the grant awarded will be for overhead, which is insufficient. Integrating formal care, meaning good quality access to healthcare, for example, as a minimum. So like having maternity benefits, having access to mental health support if you need it, etc. Does cost in many environments. There's very few countries in the world where there's actually a full public health system, the way that the NHS was. Very few places have that. So actually you need to have some kind of medical insurance also. So not being able to pay for that because donors don't deem it to be important enough for budget is something that is problematic and something that has been passed down. But I also think that again, as this work has moved into formal organizations, some of it's been lost. Some of it's the praxis and the method has been lost. So care became also a soft thing, that wasn't sort of sufficient enough for organizations working on serious matters. We also assume that people leading organizations know how to do care and know what it is. I mean, very often it's interesting when people think about care, they say, oh, we need to have a budget for counseling. And I'm like, is that what care is? I actually think in real terms, it's more about building organizational cultures that are attentive to the interior realities of the people that they engage, both in their staff, but also the constituencies that they serve and work with, It's about an organizational culture that is far more attentive to what it needs. And that when you encounter, because you never know, right, the world can be distressing all of a sudden, you encounter things that create distress, that you're able actually and agile enough to consider that that's important to perhaps pause and then discuss and figure out what to do to address it. So I think it's both a kind of structural institutional thing, but then it's also about just a culture and to some extent a skill set, which is why I think it's great that people have really begun to do more work. One of the things I would encourage is to when we build our care work, to build it out with practitioners who are experts in it, leading it. I've seen so much terrible method, which is basically designed by people who think they know how to do care, and then they hire a healer to come in and lead a session, and the healer's like, I can't heal people in an hour, it doesn't work that way. Or, look, maximum 20 people, there's no way to hold the pain with a group of 300 people, I just can't do it. You know what I mean? Or I come from a tradition that is based on engaging ancestors, so you cannot take me to a physical space that has other people's ancestors and not give me time to greet the ancestor that are there. It's dangerous. I can't just come in and start invoking ancestors. Meanwhile, the ones that are in the face of the pain is like, excuse me, who are you? How can you come and greet us and brought us anything? It's dangerous spiritually for them to do that, right? So when you create practice that is not led by practitioners, you end up in a doing things, sometimes even causing more harm, but also creating care praxis that doesn't work. So healing practitioners need to be the people who are designing healing space.
Thanks. Okay, recognizing that the emphasis of your text is about making hidden histories accessible and about capturing the breadth of feminist activism on the continent. And I think perhaps best understood as a kind of repository or an appreciative inquiry. And also a very hopeful one, right? Because an archive assumes a future. I was wondering if you made any conscious or inadvertent trade-offs while writing this, and perhaps particularly in relation to homogenizing Africa, which comes with the risk, obviously, of essentializing or fetishizing African feminism or feminisms and women. Or if there were any points when you felt you had to suspend a critical narrative in order to be a scribe, you know, to step back and kind of play that role.
Yeah, I like that question. Someone asked me that before, actually. I thought this is so interesting. So in our spaces, we use African and don't see it as generalizing, but I think it's because the choice to name something as African for us is a political choice. So there's nothing inherent about it. It's more that you are choosing to say, I am part of a freedom praxis, a liberatory project that is interested in the liberation of all Africans and all African descendant communities. So it's sort of like, and so within that, you can be multiple. So people like, you say, okay, I'm Zimbabwean and I'm also, you know what I mean, like engage, this particular, I'm from the left and I'm queer and I'm this and I'm also an African. Do you see? So it's actually a kind of, it's a conscious, active, agented choice to create that as a political identity. So what I tried to do in the text is I did try to use plurals as much as possible. I suppose it could have been African feminist praxis, but that's just not true. And then also what I tried to do was to just also be really specific. So I gave you examples that relate to specific intervention. But then I draw the threads together to find a similarity in it. Do you see what I mean? But I did try to be as specific as possible in the examples and give some amount of context. It is a short text, intentionally actually per se, as part of the series that they wanted to be more accessible to non-academic academics. Academic books are so expensive. So they had to make it a shorter series just so that it could be at a price point that's available. So, it was, the word count was limited, but I wanted to make sure that I mentioned everything. And so I tried to be as specific as possible, but the African there, again, is not meant to say that there is something essential, but rather that this is an active choice of people to contribute to a broader liberatory project. In the independence struggles, for example, everything was interconnected. So Tanzania, a lot of Southern Africans have very fond relationships to Tanzania as one of the places that was kind of a home, for people. Same with Ghana. Ghana was very active in its solidarity with, other struggles, the Congos, etc. I speak a lot about Egyptians, Tunisians, Sudanese. So I understand that region. And also everybody that I identify in here as an African feminist identifies themselves as that too. So it isn't a kind of imposition of an identity. But, in terms of what was compressed, so yeah, I didn't focus heavily on critique. And there's always critique, you can always critique, but to begin, I didn't feel that was actually wholly necessary. Do you know what I mean? And also I was trying, again, I felt my responsibility was to best represent what I understood to be the contribution. And I actually felt at times that if I started layering on critique, it would just almost be arrogant on my part. There was just this sort of feeling that like, well, okay, but all of it's an offering. And some of it, the critique and contention is implicit. So for example, in the section on pleasure, I do, speak about the interventions that are slightly more individual in focus, of thinking about, kind of supporting individual choice and individual pleasure, expanding space for individual pleasure. But I also have a segment called Pleasure for the People, where I talk about interventions that are actually more focused on dealing with the structural roots of the reason why people are not having pleasurable lives, because you can for yourself as much as you want, but to be honest with you, right, you shouldn't have to be dealing with a structured environment where the encounter is constant violation and compromise, right? And so if you don't deal with that, it's very difficult to articulate what's a kind of a firm or full pleasure. And also it becomes something that becomes the access of a consumerist kind of agenda a little bit, of like access to this tool and that technique and this thing, as opposed to something that's about creating a structural environment for pleasure for everybody. So like I said, some of it is an implicit question or just kind of setting things next to each other so you can enjoy the conversation and see what you think. But yeah, I would say the one thing I didn't do is go heavily into critique. And like I said, like partly for brevity, partly because I just wasn't sure for this particular offering if that was necessary, you know? And I would leave it to other people to critique. Like I said, the whole point is to stimulate so more people write. So like, it's a provocation, particularly to other African feminists, to just write more, you know, to write.
I like that. Brave offering. So I think we're going to move on to Priya's intervention, if that's okay, unless you want to say anything else now, just to give time for some questions. So Priya recommends teachers and researchers on anti-colonial and abolitionary feminisms, studying the interactions of coloniality, racial capitalism, and gender and caste hierarchies in South Asia. Her recent work focuses on feminist and queer struggle against backlash, and she's going to reflect on the book in relation both to the South Asian context and to transnational backlash and the possibilities for transnational feminist solidarity. Take it away. Absolutely. I can take it off there.
Thanks, Jessica. And thanks so much, Jessica, for writing this incredible book and for being in conversation with us today, especially at this particularly challenging time for feminists all over the world. So we are, as everyone here is painfully aware, in living and working in quite dark times with genocide in Gaza, protracted armed conflict in Sudan, Ukraine, Syria, the DRC, gender apartheid in Afghanistan, all unfolding alongside a global shift towards right-wing authoritarianism. All of these, we know, are the dividends of an entrenched racial capitalism, imperialism, ethno-nationalism, and cis-heteropatriarchy. And we also live in times of transnational anti-gender backlash with a well-resourced and escalating set of attacks on gender and sexual rights and activists across the globe. So in some ways, it's a moment of some collective grieving and loss in which we receive this crucial archive of African feminist praxis. And so in my reading of it, I was looking to it for some hope and wisdom in these times. And the first source of hope and power that I found was in its fundamentally Pan-African nature, in its irreverence to borders and states, and its celebration of a collective that transcends the limited imagined community of a nation. The book advances and embodies this proudly Africanist tradition that you were just talking about, telling a history of shared anti-colonial struggles, triumphs, and also shared post-colonial tribulations. And it's a history that really feels quite familiar to the part of the world that I come from, which is South Asia and specifically India. But in reading this, I really lamented the absence and even impossibility of a similar South Asian feminist praxis, much less a pan-Asian feminist one. So in trying to make sense of this impossibility, I found it really useful to think with the frame that you used for your first chapter of kinship. This chapter, of course, as you said, charts African feminism's quite conflicted relationship with questions of belonging and affiliation to the family, the post-colonial nation, the African collective. And you speak of African feminists' difficulty with kinship, but also their reclamation of it. The structure of kinship is perhaps even more fraught in South Asia for a few reasons. First, of course, the birth of the subcontinent is not simply marked by the shadow of colonial occupation and liberation, but also the originary wound of partition. So it's a subcontinent whose birth is drenched in the blood of its own communities, divided along sectarian or religious lines. And second, and perhaps even more importantly, there's the foundational structural reality of caste. So kinship in South Asia is a sign of not just patriarchal, but of caste violence, and is really the fundamental structural impediment to justice and liberation in our part of the world. And of course, it is also then crucially a barrier to feminist solidarity, as dominant feminisms in the region continue to betray enduring investments in caste hierarchies. So in South Asia, there is this persistent haunting of difference, of religious, caste, class, and so many other differences. And this then brings me to another really useful lesson from the book. The book approaches the question of difference within the African feminist landscape through the frame of the wound within feminist collectives, ambitions, and aspirations. And in doing this, I feel like you make a really important and quite unique narrative choice. And this is a choice not to frame the book around foundational tensions or erasures. And this is actually quite a common practice increasingly in the telling of feminist histories. So instead, the reader is nudged to recognize difference without allowing it to be all-consuming or totalizing. The question of difference is never allowed to eclipse a more loud and steadfast focus on the healing and generative capacities of collective activism. At an event just yesterday with the company Backlash colleagues, we had a brilliant Brazilian colleague, Mayra, remind us that the common ground is bigger than the spaces between us. And this book entirely embraces that ethos at a very important time. And of course, in doing this, we want to pay constant and careful attention to who bears the pain and scars of this wound of difference within, and also who does the labor of healing it. And these are really important structural questions that you surface at various points throughout the book. Now, staying with this really generative metaphor of the wound, I want to close by echoing another really important element of your book, which is this crucial insistence that African feminism not be defined by woundedness, or seeing injury and subjugation not as a state, but a stage. And this resonates quite closely with a lot of post-colonial Indian feminisms, like the work of Rajeshwari Sundarajan, who writes about the radical subjectivity of pain, insisting that it is in our shared oppression and struggle that we find the material for our liberation. It also chimes with Rumi's quote that the wound is where the light enters. The wound is an opening. So the book is an archive of struggle, resistance, transformation, and hope. But importantly, it is all of this without naive optimism. It is not an uncritical romanticization of suffering and wounded subjects and subjectivities, but a celebration of how, in the face of immense and multiple forces of violence and erasure, feminists have and continue to come together. And through their collective practices of refusal, care, and healing, through their insistence on pleasure and defiance, they have nudged us ever closer to a liberatory future. So thank you so much again for writing it. And I wanted to end with questions specifically on your reflections on the possibilities and challenges for a transnational feminist solidarity at this moment, or even perhaps a revival of a third world internationalism that quite a few of us have quite a bit of nostalgia for, where African, Asian, Latin American diaspora feminists all come together while recognizing and attending to the wounds of structural difference. And how do we do that in this movement today? And how do we also do it without uncritically fetishizing South-South collaborations, as Sheila Rai has warned us about, because there are many Norths in the South and scattered hegemonies and all the things that we need to contend with. But thank you so much for your beautiful and inspiring book.
Thank you, Priya, for that reading. Actually, it's really beautiful to hear the echoes back. And I hear you about kind of the foundational pain, also of a lot of what comes out of the creation of the nation for us has always been so hard. And so absolutely to transnationalism, if we can move beyond. I think it's perfect time, guys. It's time for us to get together. What do you think? It's sincerely time for us to get together. So there are a couple of things that make it possible. So one is the fact that it's always existed. And many of the people who were part of the very active efforts to link and connect are still alive. And that through social media, there are also new kinds of connections and formations that have happened. So I think there's just some practical things. So there's a perspective shift. So I feel like for people who really feel this strongly, it's time to just raise the voice and really talk about it. Because I think some of these things are like, the more you say it and the more you kind of think through it, the more that it happens actually. You know what I mean? And the more that you say, oh, we're planning to organize this session on South Asia, maybe we should bring in, you know, some people from another environment, we can have dialogue about it and begin to see similarities and you know, conversations that are in common, and then you build from commonality normally, right? So there's just a few structural things. So one is just that it can be expensive. However, I'm always curious about the fact that back in the day, without like fast air travel and everything, people used to organize these like vast congresses. You know what I mean? With people from all over the world. You know what I mean? We're taking donkeys and everything to get there. And so now we have like, you know, air travel and all of these things that are faster. Secondly, we can make good use of online platforms, although I would say that I think the power of the old organizing was that people knew each other quite well, and they were actually invested in each other's lives. And if you look in detail at it, very often when somebody was facing distress, they would end up in the home of another in another country, right? So it's some of like, it's a deeper kind of relating than just sort of surface kind of, oh, I know your name and we chat online. And the second is language. So it's again just a time to really lean into the translators and interpreters of the world, and there are many who actually would be up for this kind of project. To people that are already doing self platform organizing and see if there's a way to expand what they do and join in there. There's actually a lot of platforms of different kinds. So there's like the food sovereignty movement that's linking kind of, you know, people largely peasant farmers and people involved in actual agricultural food production across the world. There's all of the indigenous platforms that are very strong. This is like the Association for Women's Rights and Development, AWID, who again have always done transnational. There's all sorts of different spaces that are already there. So I feel like it's just a time to really strengthen it. The Afro-descendant organizing with Colombia and Brazil is now far stronger. And again, how does that link to the African continent and how to connect it there? But yeah, language. So it's just to really think thoughtfully about how we engage language, because in my experience of doing transnational work, that's the one thing that can fall apart a little bit. So we can't be overly Anglophone. We have to think about understanding and getting good translation and interpretation in other languages, and also making that literature accessible to Anglophones. Because you find Lusophones, you find Arabic speakers who've read everything in English, but we know nothing, right, about what's being produced in Portuguese or, you know, in Arabic or even in French, let alone the other languages of the world that people speak. So I'd say it's time for it. Yeah, it's time for it. And of course the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa formation, it's been a big rush to join actually, as the multipolar world becomes even more multipolar. And so I just think if the kind of formal leadership of those nations are in conversation, why are the social movements not in conversation? So I think it's an opportunity actually to think about how to connect laterally in a different way there.
Thank you. We're going to open the floor to questions now. And maybe move between online and questions in the room. I'm going to start with the room.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for being here today and for sharing the stories of this woman and your work. My question is more about, you mentioned that African feminism, or the work, is a continuation of the liberation struggle. One thing that some African feminists have pointed out is the pre-colonial era. And in this pre-colonial era, we didn't have African women were part of decision-making bodies. They were respected. They held some sort of power over men. And in some cases, the colonial system misunderstood these customary things. They codified those things and they separated Africa from its more egalitarian roots. And I was wondering, where does that figure into your work?
Okay, to take 2 or 3 questions.
Okay, this is from Sky, writing from Cape Town. I've yet to get hold of the book and read it, but from what I know, Jessica, and I've read about the book so far, the book is not only a necessary archive, but is written with such care and thought. As for my question, I know that the practice of remembering, writing, and honouring our histories and experiences, whilst can bring much joy and pleasure, can also be emotionally labouring, especially when remembering and writing during this type of global unrest and violence. What rituals, if any, did you lean into enable you to conjure up all your memories and words onto paper? And outside of the excerpts you have already referenced, which chapters were difficult to write and which ones were easier on the nervous system?
Thanks, Derek. We have one more question from the floor. Susie.
Okay. Thank you so much on a feeling, thinking level. That was really lovely to hear. And in these dark times, I know you said the timing wasn't exactly planned, but it seems like just the right moment for a book that is appreciative and building solidarity. And so I really appreciate that and can't wait to get hold of it. And my question is, I didn't hear the word sexuality in the discussion so far, and I wondered if and how it figures in the book, or what you think the role of sexuality is in the liberatory project that you're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. So in terms of Africa pre-colonial, so the continents, so the pre-colonial, what's interesting about the pre-colonial history is that it also has its history. So it's not that everything was the same and then colonization happened and suddenly things changed, right? There was also communities that were conquered, changed their ways, like the spread of Islam. I mean, there was many things that happened in that period. I mean, I think we have quite a number of examples to show that the understandings of what we now call gender were different. Because again, there's a lot of contention, particularly from Nigerian feminists, I would say, it mainly tends to come. Questioning whether or not gender was even an organizing principle of society pre-colonially. It varies a lot because the continent is really, really varied, to be honest with you. It really varies. So for example, you'll find in a lot of the coastal West African trading communities, women had a very strong role in trade. And so when there's market economies, women had a very, very strong role in trade and had actually a lot of economic power because they traded in basic commodities. So when you're trading in rice and, like staple foods, it gives you a lot of power, right? So one day stockbrokers. And so all of that transformed, of course, in the colonial. So I'd say it depends, and I would say that in different, for different communities, it's useful to look and see if there is actually a way to reference the pre-colonial ways of being that actually show that fundamentally feminism is not external to Africa, or the idea that there should be some kind of emancipatory power of women should not be understood as something that's an external idea. But yeah, I'm always just a bit careful with some of that, because like I said, I think it just depends. So I think what's better is to be more specific, to give examples of specific places and speak about that. What for sure happened with colonization is that whatever existed was taken away. That is for sure. And formally, and the speed at which African men everywhere were more than happy to be identified as the leaders, the rulers, right, the heirs and the owners of land. The speed at which they did that was also a little bit telling. Because if they really had egalitarian hearts, would they have resisted? Why were the men not as involved in contesting sexist colonial policy, right? So I think I talk about, the fact that basically colonial patriarchies gave domestic patriarchs a leg up you know, and they were happy to take it. So, you know, I feel like that's a very important conversation. I also wish it was an area that people from many different, more environments wrote about. Because like I said, we know a lot, I think, from some communities in Nigeria, not all communities in Nigeria as a reference point, in particular in that conversation, some in Southern Africa, but I think it's actually helpful to do more research on this. So to me, that's an open question that I'm interested in very much. In terms of Sky, that's a very thoughtful question. I mean, overall, I actually, this was not a hard book to write emotionally. I loved it. I felt blessed every time I sat down when I was researching and reading and finding texts that I didn't know existed because they're in paywalls and obscure journals. You know, I just was like, I am so grateful to be able to be awake at 5 a.m. to try to write this book, you know, an immense feeling of gratitude. And in particular, the memory chapter was bittersweet, but I actually found it, the process of writing about Winnie Mandela, I know we have a conversation to have, was actually just really trying to feel, I listened, I mean, over and over and over and over and over again to South African women articulating how they felt about her over and over and over and over again to understand the feeling behind it. You know what I mean? Because I was trying to understand what were they feeling so that I could try to translate that into writing. I would say just in terms of the hardest chapter was actually kinship, because I just felt this growing sense of anger about how African women's presence and was just excised from the conversation, just growing sense of anger. And every single thing I looked at, I thought, wait a minute, that is outrageous. Outrageous. Like the conversations on marital rape, you know, that were codified in former British colonies because of taking on common law, British common law in the legal codes, in the legal system. And, you know, even though the marital rape provisions were overturned in the UK, you have African patriarchs sitting in parliament talking about how dare you, this is African culture, how dare you claim that if a woman marries a man, she has a right to say no, how dare you, this is African culture. And I'm like, no, it was a British lawmaker called Sir Matthew Hale, you know, who decided that he wanted the right, obviously, to abuse his own wife, and therefore codified in law, you know, for all of the colonies too, right? The fact that this was just, you know, marriage was basically the indication of perpetual consent. So that to me, I think, was the hardest and maybe why it remains the heaviest, because I was just trying to almost like moving through sludge in terms of just really trying to understand how heavy the patriarchy came in to excise women, like I said, from mutual kinship in that way. To Susie, yeah, there's a lot of sex in there and sexuality, actually. You might enjoy the pleasure chapter, but also in general, because I think that questions of sexuality are very linked to questions of kinship. That basically that idea of who belongs and how do they belong. And so much actually of belonging is linked to sexual politics. And who's considered to belong and who isn't, and how you enter into a community is often through sexual politics. So I speak quite a bit about it in the different sections, and I talk a lot about, you know, queer African existence and the different interventions in different ways. Because I think sometimes also to only link sexuality to questions of pleasure is to miss what the politics is, that is ultimately not just about an embodied feeling, it's also about, like I said, just the terms upon which we're able to articulate ourselves in society, the way we're able to participate and belong, but also what the contributions are in other ways in terms of memory, visibilizing different communities and all of that. So it's actually quite an ongoing presence, like I said, in the text. Yeah.
Thank you. Garrett, do you have all my questions? Anyone in the room want to ask a question?
Thank you for that. I haven't read the book. I'm really looking forward to it, and the answer to my question is probably in there somewhere. But let me just ask it, just so I can get your perspective on it, is for a lot of us, the concern really right now is that this situation, and that Priya went into quite a bit of detail on as well. So what really struck me is you saying articulating the us. And I wanted to think a little bit more about what actually not just articulating, but creating the us actually means in these circumstances. Because what's really defined it are two things. One, of course, is polarization, and polarization has everyone on different sides, completely different sides, in a way in which they don't want to come together on common ground. And that's really what's defining what we're seeing. The other one is, what is the politics of any of this anymore? What is the politics that we connect to through these struggles anymore? Because the other thing that defines the current moment is the rise of the right and the disintegration almost of the left that could have borne part of that struggle and moved it forward. So it's a sort of two-part question: is how do you create the us, articulate the us in this time, and what is the politics for that us to connect to?
Thank you. Question at the back as well.
Thank you so much for the talk. Thank you for coming to our yes. My question is the book. I'm looking forward to reading the book, and the book is a lot of sources from Africa. My question is, if a young Syrian feminist were reading the book today, what messages, ideas, stories you want them to keep in them?
It's a little link to Shandana's as well. And, you know, I don't want to bring down the message of hope and wisdom in the book, which I think is great. But I wondered, in the current context, what is your perception of the challenges of operationalizing care and healing? And care and healing not in that kind of one-off, an hour in somewhere, as a process, not a one-off event. Given that Hochgute mentioned sustainability feminist activism 25 years ago or something, and you know, in 2015 with Ruto mentioned that you know there's so much reference to collective harm without how we deal with it. So, as I said, I don't want to bring things down, but I would really appreciate your perceptions on that.
Okay, so to the what to do about the current moment and backlash. So one thing, please, my beautiful friends, you must remember, is that if backlash is strong, it is because our work has been powerful. If you were doing things that were inconsequential, there would be no backlash to them. If you have made interventions that are actually changing things, the backlash is an index of that. Okay, so one of the things that I feel like we have to first acknowledge is that the scale of the response, to the point of even, you know, trying to ban children's books about doing your daughter's hair, would suggest that our interventions have been powerful. So take that to heart, because it's an important thing to consider. We don't have to sit here and say we have failed. Remember, any politics is an attempt. It's a constant attempt to assert itself. It is not final, right? Change is a constant. It is not final. It is just an attempt. It can be a very forceful attempt. It can be backed by, again, a lot of formal power, but it's just an attempt to assert itself. So if you look across the world, you see many attempts to assert a certain kind of way of dealing, which are highly exclusionary, which are highly violent, which are not kind, and which exclude. And to that, I would say it's just an attempt. We just need to do our work with more vigor, because ours is also an attempt. If you look from an electoral politics perspective, I think it's very wise to look at actual voting patterns. Because in many contexts, it's only about a third of the electorate that's actually voted authoritarians in, which means that 2/3 of the electorate are actually don't agree. That's fascinating, right? So again, just remember that all of it is an attempt to assert and to institute certain forms of power. And again, we're in constant dialogue and conversation, right? It's a process. Everything is process when it comes to power. So I think it's important to consider that. And then also in our own politics again, so we spoke here about how I actually didn't, and I love, Priya, how you noticed that I didn't focus incessantly on what we're fighting about or how we disagree. It is possible to do that, right? You don't have to constantly focus on the thing that you don't like about the other person or the other piece of the movement. You don't have to do that. You can say, do you know what? Actually, I find it a little problematic that you're still exclusionary on these questions, or you're still doing this. But if it's not, like, there must be a way to say, do you know what, for now, let's just say we're disagreeing on this and we honestly disagree. But we're gonna figure out the space that we have, that we share, so that we can expand. And we'll work on it. Yeah, we'll work on the rest. But for now, we need each other more as friends than we do as you know, further, right? And so to really think about how is it that we come together. This is not an African feminist, but there's a, I'm going to get his name wrong. I feel like his name is, I've forgotten his name, you know. Anyway, he's based in the Bay Area, and he does a lot of work around kind of trying to, I'll send it as a link for people. Trying to bring people together in very difficult circumstances. So, for example, the parent of a person who's been killed and the person that killed them, to try to find a place of repair. And so he has this really beautiful way of thinking about how you can actually come to a place where you're not just forgiving and saying everything is fine, because it's not, but you're finding a way to actually be able to engage the other person's humanity so that you can move. And I think it's some of these types of skills that we also need to be getting better at, so we can figure out a way to be together, holding the things that hurt us, as long as they don't harm us, it's different, but then being able to move together so that we can make a change. I love your question about what would a young Syrian feminist learn. So again, I not knowing enough about Syria, except for the little that I know, would perhaps be to say that out of devastation, life is still possible. So even in environments where everything, it feels, is lost, it is still possible to reconstitute life. And I think that a lot of people on the African continent have been through horrendous civil wars that have had minimal engagement, really, or minimal support in the aftermath. You may have some formal interventions, the UN comes in, some NGOs and do some stuff, but in real terms, you've lost everything of your life, including the people you love the most. And you yourself have been violated in unimaginable ways, and what do you do with that? So I think that coming together is the first form of power, and finding that in the together, finding the ways to heal, but that life is still possible. And that also, in a way, the biggest life force is your art, your culture, your history, your connect, like you still have. And that also other people will be there for you. I think that we often don't recognize how much other people watch devastation in the world and actually deeply care that it's happening. I remember with my mom, like if we would watch or hear about something in the news, like a plane crash or whatever, she'd be so upset. And she's like, but that's somebody else's child, that's somebody's child, that's somebody's child that has died, you know? And so I think we underestimate actually how much everyday people feel and have a solidarity with other people's suffering and actually want to help. So I feel that that would be the other thing, is to just say that people actually really do care and are here to consider how they might be able to contribute to like I said, just regenerating the possibility of a life and to any harm, you know, on the wounds. In terms of the challenges of operationalizing care, having like tried to do that, I would say, like I said at the beginning, that I think one of the lessons learned is that in any other intervention, like you wouldn't do an agricultural intervention and have people who have no idea how to plant and make a crop grow be the people to find, well, my,
Yes.
Anyway, so, but generally speaking, okay, it would not be wise to say, okay, we're gonna grow this field of mangoes, and then have people who have absolutely no idea about how to grow mangoes, growing it. But somehow in the work on care, we give the task to people who actually don't know how to facilitate care process, care praxis. So I would say the first thing we need to change is to put healers, right, of different kinds, and whatever in the broadest sense, as the people who are shaping the way that we go about care work. I think if we did that, then I think we would be able to succeed with some of the institutional efforts. There's been a huge amount of money put into it, to be honest with you. It's fine, it may be insufficient, but it's there. And so I actually think that that's one thing that would help.
Thank you. Do you want to ask any question? Are there any other questions from the audience? Well, online. And then we have a panel question.
Okay, this is from Martha from Amplify Change. Thank you so much, Jessica. Can international donors get away from acknowledging feminism in their work because they are not sure what feminist principle they should follow, being that feminism has so many types and differs in context?
Jessica, to add to that and to start to close as well, is there anything is missing in the book, you think, or anything you really wanted to include or anything that after writing it, you're now saying, you know, for the next one, how do I do this?
So on the question on feminism, I mean, I think sometimes it's good to just simplify the terms so that not, and really what feminisms share, regardless of where they are, is basically an interest to name and a willingness to engage gendered power towards its transformation. So looking at power and understanding gendered power and how you change that. And so I think, I mean, in real terms, if you're doing an intervention in the social domain and in people's lives, it's just part of your good analysis, right? To figure out what's the power dynamics, right, at play here. And so I think that's the way to do it. And then you can, in the environments that you're in, you can then also understand what are the feminist questions and contentions and conversations happening, right? And pay attention to that and say, okay, so how do we then inform our process, right? And the shape of our programming and the shape of our funding in ways that are informed by that, so we don't make mistakes. In the early work on violence against women, for example, there were, some assumptions that, for example, like the issue is just that women are not economically independent. And so if we get women into situations where they have increased income, then it will lead to greater independence and they can leave the man, or they can, like they have more autonomy to do something. And actually there's data to show that in the beginning, at least in many of these interventions, there was spikes in intimate partner violence. Because actually what you're doing is you're giving a woman more money, the man feels even more emasculated, and we know that intimate partner violence is a question of power, right? It's not a question of a man's bad attitude, it's actually a question of power. And so you are making the power dynamic, right, even more tense from the man's perspective, because he's feeling emasculated because now he has a wife who's earning more than him and has more authority than him, and it led to a spike in violence. If you'd done a proper gender power analysis, you could have anticipated that, and again put in measures to actually be able to mitigate, right, the likelihood of that happening. So I feel like it's also a thing of doing no harm, and for donors to really consider how do you do no harm in interventions, right, and not reinforce power dynamics or make them worse. I think that's not, I mean, donors should take that very seriously. It's responsible to do that, actually. So I do think it's possible to program around this. Of course, in the funding space, there's always the demand to fund feminist organizations and feminist platforms, and I agree with that too, because again, on an ongoing basis, you also need to ensure that there's a critical mass of people who are engaging in the questions in the local environment, national environment, internationally. and offering new thoughts and new ideas and to continue that evolution. I think it's very important to ensure that that's part of the mix. But like I said, I think it's possible to program around it. It's just about finding ways to do the analysis, what the feminist implications are of the thing that you're proposing, what a feminist angle would say about how you go about it, and do that again informed by the feminisms of the place that you're in. On what's missing, that's so hard, isn't it? I mean, there's also lots of like examples and conversations that are not in there. For example, I really did feel like I ended up really feeling like I needed to actually go, like I said, I wanted to do it about the last 20 years, but then I felt I really needed to actually pay good attention to the liberation because I felt like it was so foundational that it had to. So I feel like I didn't pay enough attention in here to digital activism, which is more recent, but has also another complex layer of it, and I felt like I couldn't do it justice. Some of the examples, like for example, around the Rwanda genocide and the International Tribunal, I feel like that in a way I a little oversimplified. I was just trying to make the point about the fact that actually if the Rwandese women themselves were not willing to testify and didn't organize, we would now have no international precedent. So when we think about who makes the law, we very often don't think about actually the people willing to come forward to put their case. They actually are a part of making that precedent. But of course, there was a whole other infrastructure of people who were in the legal side of it. And again, maybe I will rectify write a more ample thing. And lastly, I mean, I talked about, like I said, the critique and, but for now, I didn't feel like it was wholly necessary to the story because actually, and to the analysis, because actually, it was almost like another layer down, do you know what I mean? And if I didn't do it thoroughly enough, I just feel like it wouldn't have been that constructive, that instructive. So.
Thank you. I am going to use my position as chair and ask you another question. And I wanted to, because I'm a big fan of your poems, and I wanted to connect some of your poetry to this book. And I was listening to you reading a poem about, or at least addressed to a colleague that you write with. And in it, you talked about glimpses of immaculate anger, which I just love, and the kind of the word crunchiness in that is fantastic. And in terms of the form of the book, as I mentioned, I really felt that there was a kind of epistemological alchemy that happened within each chapter, where you move from kind of despair to hope in a way, and I can feel you almost kind of grappling with making that happen. And there's a distinct lack of anger, actually. And what is that about? Is it where you're at, or is it intentional, or yeah?
I mean, I one of the leads in the capacity for poesis. So, and in a way, the reason that I picked the metaphor of cartography and I actually tried to weave in the cartographic metaphor throughout was a way of just talking about this process of recharting as a poesis. So, I was talking about the capacity to keep making and remaking the world, because that's ultimately what activist practice is about. You have to believe that you can change something. That's the animating force behind it. Of course, we're angry. I mean, my word, the things that have been done are so outrageous. They are so egregious. I mean, the things that have been done to us. But it's almost like, why keep focusing on the wound? But now, I would hope everybody knows. So my point is, if I only have 35,000 words, I'm going to focus on the things we've done about it, right? Because to me, that was more interesting. It's almost like you give your power to the oppressor by giving them constant voice and being like, ooh, and look what power they had over me here, and look what power they had over me there. I thought, no, look what power we've had over ourselves when we tell you about it, right? And also because, again, there's far less of that in the world. We don't hear the stories, we hear the constant kind of litany of the abuse, but less of the resistance to it. And so I just felt very strongly that that was important. But again, there is this magic, and like I said, English is a very limiting language. I pushed in a way, I was sort of aware, okay, this is an academic book, but it's supposed to be a crossover to other audiences. I just thought, let me just mix it up and see what happens, but also put as much of the voices of all kinds of feminist practitioners, from musicians to poets to, you know what I mean, like, so that this could also be academics, so that it could also be offer that open, far more open space, you know, open space that is a bit more textured, offers more space to add in new things, you know? Yeah. Yeah. I believe very strongly in beauty, by the way. And I believe that beauty will save us. Beauty will save us. And so we have to also keep connecting into whatever you find beautiful in the world as a thing that will sustain your existence. Yeah. So I think it was that. I kept trying to connect into that. The desire for freedom is a very beautiful desire. And like I said, it is more powerful in a way than the desire to harm, you know. And so I just wanted to keep connecting to it so that it could offer up a sense of the possibility of transformation.
Thank you very much. Any last question before we close, or contribution? Anyone? Okay.
Anything you could do differently? You rewrote it.
I would have like a 2-year funded research project.
I'll wake up at 5.
You know, honestly. Again, it could have been longer, but it was the format of the book. I think it was a good, it works as an offering, and like I said, I just feel like there's lots of things to expand, you know, but I almost felt like it was actually more important to signal the breadth than focus on only one thing.
And to actually finish it also, right?
I know.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know, there's lots of voices that I wanted to do. The citational practice in here is very intentional. I literally only reference African feminists. I mean, I think we have a Paulo Freire and Luca Cabral there. That's right. But I basically only reference African feminists, and part of it was intentional because I was trying to say it's not to say that our work is not informed by people elsewhere, of course it is, right? But it was just a kind of political note to say it is actually possible to create an entire referential universe only with African feminists. So don't come and tell me that you cannot reference us because I've created a whole book that only references us. So, you know, but I mean, like I said, there could have been more, it could have been deeper, could have, you know, there was a lot of francophone work that I was, as it isn't surface, and lots of things, right? But it is what it is, everything has an ending, right? Especially when it comes to books and deadlines.
Maybe this is just the beginning.
Yeah. It's true. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Well, I guess what's next for you, intellectually, politically, artistically, what's next? What are you excited about?
I mean, I'm very excited about this moment. Like, I actually love that the backlash is so explicit. I think it really helps. You know, when things are a little like not quite sure what's going on, a little vague, it's actually harder to position yourself. Sometimes it's better when things are just explicit because it actually gives you, like I said, a very clear red line, right, that you're working with. And I'm very excited about the new questions that this moment is engendering. I am very interested in transnational conversations right now, and I am going to look to write, you know, but I want to actually read more first, and read in not just in the sense of reading books, but I actually want to re-look at where the conversations are today and spend some time doing that. So I also get a sense of where is their sparks, where is their dynamism, where is their life, and then really think about what next in terms of expanding these conversations. And like I said, my hope is everybody that writes to me, you know, and says, oh, I just read it and did this, I said, I really write it. So I really do hope that, again, in particular for African feminists who read it, to write in response, to write something that it stimulates, to write, you know, and like I said, write in the broadest sense, but also to write in the sense of formal, referenceable text. And I am happy to encourage that. So I'm thinking about ways to do that.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming.